Welcome back. In this video, I am talking about Mark 2:18 through 28. In this passage, in this section, Jesus has two different encounters with the Pharisees. Really, you could kind of take this section all the way through the first encounter in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. But here we have Jesus having two encounters with the Pharisees. The first is about the fact that the disciples do not fast. Jesus's disciples, unlike the Pharisees, unlike the Pharisees or the disciples of John the Baptist, Jesus's disciples don't fast. So what does that mean? Fasting in first century Israel was very common. It was required on high holy days. There are certain days in the Jewish calendar where everybody is, if you are an observant Jew, required to fast. And these are complemented by required feast days where you are supposed to feast if you are an observant Jew. On top of those high holy days, there are also times where culturally people would fast, and these included death and tragic circumstances, uh, times of great prayer, kind of the same way that in certain Christian traditions we have times of prayer and fasting that revolve around our high holy days, our life situations. And then the Pharisees, on top of this, added 2 days a week of fasting. So they would fast twice a week, just as a steady, ongoing practice throughout the year, unless those days fell on feast days. And this practice was eventually adopted by many Christians. Christians used to fast twice a week. This is mentioned in the Didache. It's also mentioned in other early texts. And these days were meant to help people grow spiritually, but they were also supposed to be distinct from the Jewish fast days. This way, when people saw you fasting, they knew you were not fasting for Jewish reasons. So Christians began fasting Wednesdays and Fridays because these were not Jewish fast days. So the Christians could have them. But here we see in this passage, Jesus' disciples are not fasting. And the Pharisees say, why? Why aren't you fasting? And what is important for us is that Jesus says, because I am the groom and this is the wedding feast. So how are they supposed to fast? Now, I think it's interesting that Jesus uses this language because when you talk about a wedding, you're talking about an event that happens one time and then people go back to normal. So what Jesus is saying to the people, to the Pharisees here, is that his disciples are at the special event because they're with him. And then when he is taken away, their life will resume that normal rhythm. He is not in any way undermining their ideas about fasting and the importance of fasting. He is actually kind of saying, you do a good thing. You're doing very well by fasting. Since right now, as I'm recording, we're coming up on Lent in a little under 2 weeks now, we should be thinking about fasting. And the idea that the Pharisees are complimented by Jesus should ring with us. That he's saying, hey, you're right. You guys, you have a point. Why are my disciples not fasting? Because they're in a special event. But once the event is over, once I am taken away from them, the fast will begin. They will come back to a new normal without me. And we should recognize that. We should respect it. This is further evidenced by his idea of old wine and wineskins and new wine and new wineskins. The idea, again, he is bringing something new. And with this new comes a new set of wineskins, a new set of spiritual disciplines. In other words, everything that the Pharisees are doing is probably pretty good. The fasting, the prayer, the generosity, the alms, all of that is okay in and of itself. But Jesus is giving it new meaning, new purpose, new skin, a new way of looking at it. And so what he's telling the Pharisees, you need to think bigger here. And you need to recognize what's going on, because we're giving everything that you're doing new meaning. And that's something that they have trouble with. That's where they fall down. I don't think they quite grasp the newness that Jesus is trying to explain. But we should recognize very much that Jesus is not inherently saying everything you're doing is wrong and we need to throw it out. He's not saying that. He's not necessarily saying that. He's saying we need to consider what is happening now and provide that with the proper structure for now. So life in Jesus demands a structure that is new. And we should embrace that and say, what is this new structure that this new life needs? And that's where Jesus kind of leaves that section. The next section is a little more important. It's a little more difficult. The disciples are walking through a grain field, and they are picking heads of grain, rubbing them between their hands, and then eating the grain. And they are stopped by the Pharisees, who are upset with the disciples for not honoring the Sabbath. Now, it is important to note that circumcision and Sabbath keeping are the two major elements of Judaism at this time. The idea of you must be circumcised to join the group and you must keep the Sabbath are vital to Jewish identity. So when Jesus' disciples are walking through this field, the claim that they are not honoring the Sabbath is an extremely important claim. We need to take this seriously, and we need to stop and ask what's going on, because we don't necessarily understand it just by speed reading through it, because we don't know exactly what the Pharisees are claiming, and we don't know why Jesus' disciples are doing what they're doing and what their motives were. But most likely it is that Jesus' disciples did not have other food available to them, so they are, as they walk through this field, taking advantage of one of the laws of Moses that said to landowners, leave the edges of your grain field for the poor and the needy. Let them come by and harvest some grain so that they don't starve. That seems to be what's going on. Jesus and his disciples don't have other food. As they walk to the synagogue, they're grabbing a few handfuls. It doesn't seem like they're just grabbing a snack. It does not seem that they are that they've eaten breakfast or they're on their way to a lunch and, hey, let's just grab a snack. It seems much more deliberate that they are that they've been hungry. Maybe they have fasted, or some other religious obligation, or maybe they've just gone a couple days unintentionally but haven't had food, or they ran out of food, and so they are they're having a meal by sitting down, harvesting some stalks of grain, quickly threshing the grain with their hands, and then eating it. Maybe roasting it and eating it. We don't know. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but the Pharisees see this and they say, this is work. Whatever Jesus and his disciples were doing, this is work. And by working, you are not honoring the Sabbath. What seems to be happening is that they are commenting that either threshing grain or cooking it is violating the Sabbath command of do no work. So here is where Jesus gets into a real discussion that, again, Mark is very much shrinking this discussion for us and for our sake, because there is absolutely no way, there is no way on earth that this discussion was this short. The Pharisees would not have listened to Jesus's response and not had some answer. He speaks to this in such a way that they had to have had an answer ready for him. And Jesus says to them, he compares his situation, his current situation, with David eating the bread of the divine presence that only the priests are supposed to eat. He's saying he is not minimizing the Sabbath. Notice that Jesus is not minimizing the Sabbath at all. He is not saying that it's unimportant. In fact, if anything, he says it's very important. And he seems to reinterpret its importance. He never says it's unimportant. We need to keep that in mind. But he does say, go back to 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel. Go back to 1 Samuel, where David is running for his life from King Saul. And he stops at the shrine, sees the priest Abimelech, and gets the food that only the priests are supposed to eat by lying to the priest and saying, hey, Saul sent me on a mission with my men and we don't have anything, we didn't have time to grab food before we left. Can you give us something? Which is probably not the bread that was actually on display. It was probably the week-old bread that was being removed. And David and his men show up about the time it's being removed, and they say, hey, well, if you're not doing anything with that bread, can we take it? And what Jesus is saying is that the ceremonial ritual laws that Israel has come up with in order to help them keep the Sabbath can get in the way of actually maintaining what the Sabbath is all about. The Sabbath is about rest and family and community. It's about living in a different speed. There's a great book by Walter Brueggemann called Sabbath as Resistance that I highly recommend everybody read on this topic. But the Sabbath is about entering God's time and God's space and allowing ourselves to get out of the grind of daily life. And that's what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. He's saying, you are making this about just keeping little rules and regulations, and that actually kind of demeans the Sabbath more than these guys harvesting some grain, because you're not actually seeing the purpose behind the Sabbath keeping. And to say, and he does it by equating what he's doing with David and saying, hey, listen, was David wrong to ask for that bread even though the Levitical law says he shouldn't have been allowed to eat it? Was he wrong? And this would have put them in a bind, not because they want to see David as perfect and everything he does is perfect and everything that the Old Testament says of him means it's good, but because they would have had to really evaluate David's situation and saying, well, David was running for his life from Saul. Why would he stop and get that bread? Because he was hungry. He had nothing else. It would have been wrong of him, even though it violated the letter of the law. And what Jesus wants us to see is no, it would not have violated the letter of the law. Instead, we should allow the letter of the law to bend to accommodate what the people need in order to maintain the spirit of the law. That's where Jesus comes out. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to highlight one detail that is just, it's kind of a nothing detail, but it's important in a very specific way. And that is that when what Mark writes is Jesus said, have you not read what David did when Abiathar was the high priest? Now, First Samuel, when David is running for his life, Abimelech is the high priest, not Abiathar. Abiathar, according to 1 Samuel, was Abimelech's son. So there is an error here in somebody. Did Jesus say Abiathar? Did Mark just write down Abiathar? Is there a version of 1 Samuel that has Abiathar as the father and Abimelech as the son? We don't know. Now, in Chronicles, Abiathar is listed as the father and Abimelech as the son. In Samuel, with one exception, where a scribe has clearly rewritten Samuel to make it align with Chronicles. In Samuel, Abiathar is listed as the father and Abimelech as the son. Abimelech as the father and Abiathar as the son. This gets a little confusing. And you can see why scribes might have made errors in copying and in repeating. There's a sense in which some people want to look at this line and they want to make it more than it is and say that the Bible is wrong because the Bible contains these kinds of errors. And that just, it just doesn't work. Just because, Mark wrote down Abiathar when he should have written down Abimelech doesn't mean that all of the gospel is wrong. In fact, a perfect gospel would be a little bit more suspect than something like this, where there's something that, there's some contradiction that we have to work through. At the same time, there are Christians who want to think that Mark and the rest of the Bible is completely perfect in every way possible. There is absolutely no error in it. There is no difficulty. There's nothing, and they're just honestly wrong. I know some scholars have tried to make the claim that because Abiathar would become high priest, it is okay to say that in the time of Abiathar the high priest, as long as he was alive at the time that this happened. That just makes no sense. It just really doesn't. Just because Abiathar would eventually become high priest and he was alive at this time means that this is talking about during his lifetime. It really just it doesn't work, because what Jesus is clearly saying in this line is, haven't you read what happened to this high priest, who should be named Abimelech, at least according to the version of Samuel that we have. Whether or not Jesus had a different version of Samuel that said Abiathar, I can't speak to. Maybe he did. We don't know. All that to say that even though some people make big deals about this, whether they're trying to prove there's no error or they want to prove that this error just completely defeats the Bible, either way, it's not that important. It really is not that important. It's just a misspeak, and we can accept that and move on. So the ending of it is quite important. The idea that Jesus' last word here, and again, I'm sure the Pharisees had a response to this, but Jesus' last word is, the Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And thus, the son of Adam, there's that son of man language again, is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, here, this is interesting because is he saying the son of Adam, the son of man, as in himself or as in humanity? Just humanity is Lord of the Sabbath. That's a good question. I don't know that he is being that general to say all of humanity is Lord of the Sabbath, but at the same time, it would make sense with everything else he has said. I think personally, he is elevating himself to the head of the Sabbath. Maybe that's just Christian tradition talking, because that's how Christian tradition has always understood this. Christian tradition has always said Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, but there might be a reality that Jesus is saying humanity is Lord over the Sabbath, not the Sabbath over humanity. And this is just a great reminder for us that there are some really important aspects of our faith. And I would even argue that this idea of Sabbath keeping properly understood is one of them. There are some really important elements to our faith that sometimes we can let them dictate to us rules and regulations that God does not want for us. And sometimes we need to recognize that, like Jesus, Sabbath keeping in this instance, or whatever those real important parts of our lives are, our religious lives are, those elements are very, very important. They are vital, just like Sabbath keeping would have been to Jesus and his disciples. But we cannot allow the minutiae and the details to override how these very important elements help connect us to God. And so if we are so committed to not working on the Sabbath that we can't move and experience life, maybe we've gone a little too far. At the same time, if we allow, and this is what the Pharisees were actually accusing Jesus of if we allow our freedoms to say that we don't care about this tradition, this very important part of our faith, well, then we've also messed up. And Jesus doesn't deny that. He doesn't say, well, the Sabbath isn't important. He says the Sabbath is made for humanity. In other words, the vital part of it is something we need to embrace and internalize so that we can express ourselves in it. Not that we should forget it because we're free, and this is just legalism, and not that we should allow the laws to dictate what we believe and do and how we live. We need to internalize where the laws are trying to point us, where the symbols are trying to point us, and then allow that to express itself in a life devoted to God. So that's where I think Jesus wants us to go. Again, we're trying to show that the division between Jesus and the Pharisees is not necessarily that they are just all wrong. It's that they're putting the emphasis in the wrong places. Instead of putting the emphasis on what fasting should bring to us, they are putting the emphasis on maintaining the right days and hours. Instead of putting the emphasis on how Sabbath allows us to express God's love for us, they are putting the emphasis on the rules and regulations of maintaining a proper Sabbath. And Jesus wants us to see, no, we should understand the rules and allow them to determine our lives to an extent, but we should also recognize the situation that we find ourselves in and allow our understanding of where God is and where we are moving in God to be the fullest expression of our commitment to God. So I hope that made sense. I'm sure parts of it didn't, but if there are questions or comments about any of this, please let me know. I'm glad to deal with them. I'm glad to think through them with you and to work through them with you. I would love to hear what you have to say about Mark's Gospel. So until we meet again, God bless.